Hello there, my fellow sophisticated creatives. Welcome to JCV Art Studio from the dressing room. Ozzy is about, I can hear him. He's given up watching the Olympics at the moment. Today I have Gordon Mott on the podcast. And Gordon is the author of Lithuanian Lullaby. It is an American and Canadian #1 bestseller in the Lithuania category. This book is being purchased all over the world, India, Europe, everywhere. Gordon, I have my copy and I am really enjoying it. Welcome.
Thank you for having me, Joe, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm a little disappointed Ozzy's not here, but when I am a big fan of the program, and I know that the number of barks shows his appreciation for the author. So I hope at some point he shows up, but otherwise I'll be disappointed. Great to see you again.
Good. Well, where we're at, I can hear little feet up above. So I have the TV on a bit, so hopefully he won't interrupt us. But if he does, we'll just pause for a minute and yeah.
Let him have his piece for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah. So Gordon, this book, I laugh because my spouse saw me reading it, right? And he's like, that's a big book. Okay.
Oh my goodness.
And but to me, it's like an epic story. Just, I was reading it. I think you saw my post. I was reading it on the ferry, the Brentwood Bay Ferry. And I thought, I want to be on a beach reading this. It's just, you just want to get down into it, 624 pages. I can't imagine plotting something that long. So let's talk about it. Okay. Let's talk about your book. Okay. Gordon, your book has received lots of media coverage, and I'm curious to find out, how many interviews have you been on?
Oh my goodness. Well, it's been humbling. This is my first book, now I have 2 out, and this was my first one. It's a very long read, as you know, and I was surprised that there was so much interest in the book. But I would say we're probably close to double digits now, so we're probably close to 10.
Gosh.
And I've had interest from, I've been in media outlets in Chicago, Lithuania, of course, Prague, London, Radio Free Europe. A journalist from Radio Free Europe wrote a book review, which was a lovely surprise, and it was a very positive one, so I was very pleased with it. But this coming month, September, Lithuanian Radio and Television, which is equivalent of BBC or NPR or CBC, they will do a little expose. So I'll not only be covered on their website, but I am hoping to do an interview with their part of their English language service from Berlin. So I am very excited about that prospect. But this one with at the dressing room is particularly a special one for me, Joanna. So I'm very grateful for you inviting me along, because it's my first Canadian interview, and I live in Vancouver, so it's near to my heart. So I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you.
Well, I was telling my spouse about this interview yesterday, and I told him how popular your book is and the coverage you're getting. And I said to him, why isn't Canada picking this up? Right. And so I am really honored to be interviewing you. I really am. So his comment was, well, right now it seems like everything's a sound bite, and I go, well, I'm glad. I feel like I've got the scoop. I feel like I've got the scoop. So
well, and we're so removed sometimes from the rest of the world here. a book about that really focuses on those 10 years of liberation, the liberation of Eastern Europe, doesn't attract quite as much attention in a place like Canada as it might in in Europe or in Britain. So I can see it a little bit.
Okay.
So that's why I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. Okay. So before we get into this book, you independently published it. And I was wondering, was there one moment, one interview that just blew up the popularity of Lithuanian Lullaby?
Oh my, there was. They're the largest newspaper, news media organization in the country is a newspaper called Lietuvos Rytas or Lithuanian Morning. And, we learned something that's kind of unusual about the age that we live in. So it's a big news media outlet, but they still do a physical print of their newspaper. And there's not many around that still do it. And I can tell you, Joanne, when that paper started hitting the doorsteps in Europe, we were just inundated with phone calls and texts. It's amazing that people who buy a newspaper, I guess they're vested, they've paid €1 or whatever for it, and they tend to read it cover to cover, and they tend to read entire articles. And there was a lot of excitement. The only problem was there's a time change there, and our phone started ringing late evening, and they went right through the night. So it was great to hear from so many of our Lithuanian friends, but once that broke early, I think it was maybe one of the second, third media outlets to cover that book, and it was once that one got out, there was just a storm of sales, and then additional media attention that came through.
Cool. I'll grab a paper. Like, I know, like I said, Ed's commented, he goes, wow, you're old school, because I was just flipping through, and I find it's more relaxing.
Yeah, it is. And I find I'm reading the entire article as well. It's when you're on the when you're on the internet now, it's just so much information coming at you that it's nice to be able to focus on something and to touch something. And this is something, and I suppose you're an author, you've probably learned this as well, but the physically printed books, they sell really, really well. The diehard readers still want that physical experience. It's not good enough to put it on the Kindle, right? There you go.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm curious, was publishing your book through a traditional publisher ever a thought that crossed your mind, or did you know right from the outset you were going to go independent?
Oh my goodness, Joanna, I never thought anybody would read the book. So I can safely say that the answer was no. So, and if you're lucky enough, and I think you might have one, if you're lucky enough to get a first edition, you'll probably still find a dozen typos or even more. After having it read carefully by others and myself, I must have read 8 or 9 times. I thought it was perfect, and of course it isn't. And had I worked with a professional publisher, that wouldn't have gone through. But for the formatting and for book cover and that sort of thing, it was done by a professional publisher in Manchester, and they did a really good job at making that book look aesthetically appealing.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so why Lithuania? Like, what's the connection for you to want to write this story?
It's such a mysterious, I think it's such a mysterious location, and it's a place with such a tremendous history. It's and a very tragic history over these last 100 years, with people being deported to Siberia, and then the Nazi invasion, and then the Soviet invasion, and then more people being sent to Siberia. And then there's this beautiful time, right? Of this beautiful time of refinding themselves, re-establishing themselves, not only as an independent country, not controlled by Germans or Russians or what have you, but also refinding themselves as a democratic country, and a country that there's a trading culture in Lithuania. It's a port country. It's on the Baltic, and finding that access to be entrepreneurial again, to be able to trade with people in the West, and go about their lives without other people telling them how to run their lives, being able to speak freely without other people telling them what they can say and what they can't say. So it was a magnificent time, and I thought it deserved some treatment.
Good. Well, lots of memories, or not that I've experienced anything, which when we'll talk about Vana, okay. But I just remember with my mom having grown up in Hungary, and she would say she educated my sisters and I, and she had said, I grew up in a time where you didn't complain about anything to your neighbor or to anyone, because you didn't know whether they would then tell the secret police.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah.
And
so
yeah,
you're absolutely right. And I felt, so my connection to the country is, one journalist called me a Lithuanian American. I'm neither. I am there, but it's quite a compliment to be adopted by a country, and I think it's the first country that's ever done that. The other countries that have given me citizenship have been compelled to do that. So years ago, I had an unusual encounter, and I was actually living out east. I was living in Ontario, and I was at a university called Trent University. It's in Peterborough, Ontario, and I was in my second to last year of study in political science, and I met a gentleman. His name was Darius, a very fellow student, and he was an exchange student and from Lithuania, the first exchange student that Trent had ever taken, and he was really inspiring. Here was somebody that was getting, as I mentioned, getting his country back, getting to do stuff that would be normal stuff for us in the West, to travel, to have interactions, and not to be frightened about what he said. And I was also very interested in this, as you can tell from the book, this period of what was happening around me, right? This would have been September 1991 when I think I met him. So he actually had a great suggestion. He suggested that I come and teach at a high school level in Lithuania, and he actually worked that out with the Ministry of Education. I started getting letters from the Ministry of Education in Lithuania inviting me to come and teach, and I said sure. So summer of '93, I packed up my bags and I went off to Lithuania for a year. And to your point, we saw that, you saw the reluctance of some people to engage in conversations, even though the world had moved. I think there was concern amongst some that the world could move back, and culturally, this is what it's had impact as a psychology, right? We're very used to blabbering off our mouths and saying whatever we like, and that wasn't the case then. It certainly is now.
Wow. Okay. So in your book, 6 main characters, okay, and their stories intertwine. And like you say, the story takes place between 1987 and 1997. So you're teaching in Lithuania. What was that first what if? That I always love knowing that characters. Was it a character spark? Was it an idea? What was that first what if? And what character did it involve?
Oh my goodness, Joanna, you ask incredible questions.
Well, I want to know.
Do I have an answer for that? I do. There was a there was a moment, and ironically, it does not involve any of the Lithuanian characters. So, to your point, there are 6 characters. 3 are Western characters. There's 2 Britons, an American, and a Hungarian.
Yeah.
who you mentioned, Vanna, and 2 Lithuanians, Tanya and Darius. So Vanna is actually smuggled out. It cuts her way through a wired fence in Hungary with her boyfriend in 1987 because they want to come to the West and work and see what life is like there. And she manages to get to England.
Yeah.
And things go very badly. Yeah. So her relationship with her boyfriend sours. She's indebted to smugglers. It's a very difficult situation. And then she gets mugged. So she gets robbed in front of a pub in central London. And it's a catalyst event. Yeah. And her life in the short term gets so much worse. But without that mugging, the beautiful part of the book can't take place. So she gets mugged in front of this pub, and 2 drinkers run out from the pub, 2 of the Western characters. So it's the first time we see the interaction between the Eastern and Western characters, something that becomes more intense as the book progresses. But they offer to help her out. They buy her a drink. They try and calm her down. They lend her £10. The police station is very nearby. They walk her to the police station, help her with the incident report and what have you. And that turns out to be a fatal mistake for her. Right. Because they actually recover her belongings. So the police recover Vanna's belongings along with her Austrian passport. Mm-hmm. And something sparks the constable as being unusual about that passport, because he had done the interview and had recalled her making a remark about working. Yeah. And the problem with the passport, it didn't have a visa. It didn't have a work permit. And at that time, Austria was not a member. It was a neutral country. It wasn't a member of what was then called the EEC, forerunner to what we know now as the EU. And so he alerted immigration, which would have been a minor thing at the time. She probably would have got a lecture and told not to do that anymore. But immigration looked at that passport and realized it had been doctored, that it was a fake, that the photograph had been changed. And they asked the police to call her back. And if she came and picked up her stuff, to arrest her. And that's what they did. So she comes and picks up her stuff. They arrest her for a forged document and immigration offenses. And she gets locked up in an immigration detention facility. And that's where she meets Darius. Yeah. And Darius gets refugee status. He's from Lithuania, and there's a lot of reasons for that. And she doesn't, because at this point, Hungary is quite advanced, and they don't believe that she'll face persecution. So Darius offers to marry her, and she says yes. So that's really the bottom of her life, right? She's been put in prison, prison-like facility. She's agreed to a marriage of convenience, but that's when her life is allowed to change. So now she has status in the UK. Darius turns out to be a decent guy, and she takes a job at a pub, working in a kitchen in Oxford, and from there works out her way up to head chef. And then she gets interested in business, and she builds a business from there in Lithuania eventually. And she becomes interested in spirituality and philanthropy, and so she becomes a really important member of the world's community by the end of the book. And she starts as this teenage girl that's just trying to figure out how to get through life. So that's a catalyst moment.
Okay. So was she that spark though? Was she the one that made you decide to be able to write this book? Or was it?
That's a really interesting question as well. I think the Vanna, the Hungarian character, and I think that's the irony of writing books, is that the story that I was intending to tell about the Lithuanian independence and what have you, people love Vanna, who's a Hungarian. Yeah. And I'm often asked, well, what happens to Vanna after the book, right? What's the next step? And I did a sequel. I didn't include her, but I'll have to have a look at that. But no, the impetus for the for the original book was it was to talk more about East and West and it coming together, but then the Lithuanian byline starts to really play out. And I realized I was on to something early in the book when starting to talk about the developments, and realized this was a story that had not been told. And it's, oh, there, I got one. Oh, Ozzy.
Ozzy.
Oh, fantastic. So that's $2. I feel much better. The
Gordon, just one moment. Okay, so you were saying about the Lithuanian byline, Gordon.
Yeah, so the Lithuanian byline starts to take off a life of itself. So this is a really important story, and it's repeated in different parts of Eastern Europe. And I realized it's a story that is so important. That decade was so important in our world, and it was such a positive 10 years, and yet it gets so not enough. And particularly it's been, and maybe because this is early in the process, we're only 30 years out, but it's such a tremendous period. And I can tell you this, the symbolism in this book is pretty rife. And it's one of the things that I try to include stuff that if you understood the nuances of some of the history, then it's compelling. So that wired fence that Vanna cuts through, that fence is really important in European history. It's a wired fence. When she cuts through it, they bribe a border guard to help them out. And it's an electrified wired fence. But it also is, that fence represents one of the key elements of the collapse of the East Bloc. So by 1989, which is a pivotal year, by the end of 1989, the Berlin Wall is breached, and the peoples of Europe are united. But that in 1989, they replaced that wired fence with a wooden fence, and it was purely a symbolic gesture between Austria and Hungary. A good neighbor should have fences, not wooden fences, not wires with electricity running through them. But it was critical, because not so much for Hungarians or for Austrians, but other people from the former East Bloc, they could get visas, exit visas, to go on holiday to Hungary, particularly Germans. And that's what they did en masse. In the summer of 1989, mass numbers of East Germans came for so-called holidays to Hungary and hopped that fence. And then from there, were able to make their way to West Germany, where they were considered citizens of the Federal Republic. And so that put incredible pressure on the regime in East Germany, right? They had to do something. And there were other incidents that were happening around that time as well. But they had asked for support from the Hungarian government to stop that. But the only alternative was to shoot people, and they weren't going to do that anymore. And so it was pretty much a free-for-all of people hopping over that fence in that summer of 1989.
That's so cool. Yeah. Wow, the history, geez. So your research, okay, I mean, I'm reading this book and I'm thinking, has Gordon ever been in a detention center in the UK? Have you ever been placed in a truck and smuggled into the UK? Because again, your character Vanna, I'm reading what she's doing and I'm wondering, how does Gordon know this? Because you're an English teacher or an English teacher?
I was an English teacher many moons ago.
Okay. Wow. So your research, like, how did it start?
I'm happy to say that I haven't. I haven't been detained to date. Okay. You know, it's always a compliment. People ask me if parts of the book are autobiographical or how I know that. And I think the internet is such a friend. You know, we started this discussion by slagging off the internet, but you know, as a writer, particularly someone interested in historical fiction, the amount of information, the nuances, if you're willing to put in the work, the information you can find is quite incredible. So there was an immigration detention center. Maybe there still is, near Heathrow, which is where Vanna was kept. That's a real place. And the depiction of that facility, I've tried to be as close to the information as I could find. I tried to be as close as I could. And that smuggling technique that Vanna has to deal with. She's put in a lorry and they're put at the front, and then the boxes are piled behind them, and that's pretty common. That's a common technique, and sadly, she complains that it's really hard to breathe. And sadly, 2 or 3 years ago, some group of Vietnamese migrants suffocated in the front, being transported in the same way. So Vanna was lucky, but it isn't an uncommon way to smuggle migrants.
I thought of that when I was reading that. I thought, I remember it. I remember when it was on the news. Gosh. Okay. So Vanna, and I'm thinking the last name, do you pronounce it? If I'm trying to remember what my mom used to say, is it Takash?
Yes, I think that's probably better than mine. I think your mother probably has better pronunciation than me. Takas, we might say in English, but yes, I'll go with you. I'll go with your pronunciation.
Because I don't think the S's are pronounced like S's, and
I think you're right.
And I remember her trying to teach me Hungarian and saying she'd look at, I think it was an O with the 2 dots. That's why I'm enjoying your book, because my mom's no longer with us and it's just bringing back memories. And she would say the O, you pronounce it as a I'm 8 and I'm like, really?
It is not an easy language.
No.
Nor is Lithuanian, for that matter.
Yeah. So like I said, my mom was Hungarian, and Vanna's dialogue, and there was a particular sentence where Vanna refers to one of the smugglers as being a big man. And whoa, I remember my mom telling me she would talk about somebody she knew, and she goes, yeah, he's a big man. But that was not a compliment, like when she said that, it was almost like, yeah, he's a big man. She didn't mean it in the physical, but it was almost like he's a big man, almost like gangster type, not a nice person, or like to think of himself as a big man when really he wasn't. So that was very cool to read. And so I was wondering, how did you decide that you wanted Vanna to be Hungarian? Okay, I'm always, how did you decide it?
Well, I'm glad Vanna made, again, I underestimated just the devotion for Vanna. I love her too. She's a very kind person, and very motivated as the book progresses. I think there's probably a couple of reasons. I think that one of the obvious ones is that, as I mentioned, in 1987, it's very hard to leave the East Bloc.
Okay.
Hungary is one of the few places where it would have been possible, and either through getting a visa to go to Austria, or doing what Vanna does, which is paying somebody off, right? Communism was really coming to an end. Communists are still in charge. Some people say they weren't real communists by that time. And certainly economic liberalization was occurring. Tourism within the country, encouraging foreign tourists to come, and not restricting them to talking with locals and what have you, which was something really guarded in many of the other countries. And travel opportunities that were starting to crop up for people that live there. So it would have been possible for Vanna to have gotten out, and her boyfriend, and to smuggle themselves into Western Europe, and which is what they did. But there is another reason, though. I have an attachment to Hungary. It's an emotional attachment, I think. It's one of my favorite countries in Europe. Okay. I grew up, you may have this background as well, but I grew up with Hungarians. It was not a foreign culture to me. Their parents had come after the revolution, 1956, and so it was something that I was certainly familiar with. And I was actually in Hungary in 1987. So when Vanna escapes, I spent a couple of weeks there, and it was a tremendous opportunity. And to the point about the liberalization of that state and her ability to leave, I think it was only one or two countries at the time that would allow someone poor like myself, a backpacker, to actually get in and wander around, right? And as I mentioned, I wandered around very freely all over Hungary, and was able to have conversations. English was not well known at that time. Many people spoke a little bit of German. There was some English there, and it was a fantastic experience. So that I was certainly able to take that information and make it part of Vanna's experience as she crosses and makes her way to the UK. And also, she never really loses that Hungarian kind of cultural stuff, and it comes up through the book. And I was familiar with those cultural pieces, having been exposed a little bit to Hungarian culture.
See, because another of your characters, the young man, he backpacks through Hungary.
George.
Yeah. So drawing upon your experience.
Yes. So I do get to use autobiographical elements at times for some of my characters, and George has some, and so does a few of the other characters. But yeah, you're quite right. He's and that makes it kind of a funny interaction the first time that he meets her. And unfortunately, he speaks a bit of German. And so when he first meets her and she claims to be Austrian to them, he tries to speak German, and she rebuffs that and says she's a Hungarian from a Hungarian minority. To my knowledge, no such thing exists. But she had to come up with something. And anyway, that was...
because there are more characters than just Vanna. I mean, I'm reading it in the fellow who's now, intertwined with his co-worker, the lady, and I'm just like,
Steve.
Yeah. And I'm just thinking, oh, Steve.
Yes.
What you getting up to here, Steve? Like, you just, it's cool. It is a really cool book. So
I think some people might even be confused about what these Western characters and what their role is. Sometimes, because this is a book about Lithuania, and yet Steve and Sandra, the only time they spend in Lithuania is very briefly. They go on there on holiday. But what I was trying to show at the outset of the book is Western culture is just so easy. Okay. So we've got the American character who's traveling around the world, and he's dating this French girl, and he's going to see her, and she's going to see him, and then they go off to Australia for a while, and it's quite life is good. For Steve, I mean, he's a bit of a layabout at the beginning of the book, right? He doesn't, and he decides he wants to progress a little bit, and he doesn't need to put much effort in, and he starts climbing the ladder at the British Civil Service, and he finds it quite easy to do that, and he has all these wonderful adventures and things like that, and he wants to build career notoriety, and he does it. For the Easterners, it's so much harder. It's you've got one that's a Soviet conscript, it's a refugee, and in England you've got Vanna, whose story we've talked about, and then we're going to be introduced to Tanya later on in the book, who's her life is economically very, very trying, and but so you're supposed to see the rise of the East, because the Eastern characters all rise through the book, and then you see the decline of some of the Western characters. And if you watch some of the nuances, you kind of understand there's a comparison of some of the good things about Eastern culture at that time compared to the Western culture. But I'll let readers figure that out.
Yeah, because I'm not done yet. Okay, I'm not done. And that was one thing I remember my mom used to say to us all the time. It was, you do not know how easy you have it.
Yeah.
And okay. So Vanna gets involved. We're going to go back to her a little bit with Darius. And as I'm reading, I'm thinking, with regards to Darius, as I'm reading, I'm thinking, he's a spy. He's getting information from her. Okay. He's trying to break the smuggling ring. Because he is very worldly. Okay. When he's in the detention center too. And I was wondering, he is so very believable. Did you base him off of anybody you knew, or because how do I, I'm not saying with some of my characters, okay, I will take like bits of character, I'll take characteristics. Now people are going to be wondering who I'm basing
Who am I?
my characters off of. Here's an example. Okay. I'll take characteristics from people I know. In the current book that I'm working on, one of the characteristics of the hero is he has really bad digestion. So there's scenes where he's slugging back Pepto-Bismol.
Oh
Okay.
dear.
Right. And I'm sorry, Ed. Okay. But that characteristic came to me because I was writing one day and literally my husband walked into the kitchen, opened up the fridge, grabbed the Pepto, took off the lid and went clunk. Right. And I just, Gordon, when you see, I think that's something with being a writer. You see something transpire and you think, I've got to use that. It brings such a human element to this character, right? So that's where I'm kind of, I'm not saying, not wanting to have you say, oh, Darius is based off of my best buddy that I met in the bar, but was there characteristics from individuals that you drew upon creating Darius? Because he is very real.
So I have a confession. I'm glad that's a lovely comment, actually. Thank you for that.
Right.
Because Darius might be the one exception where his personality is very closely based on my old friend Darius from university days. And he's a very stoic, cerebral, almost like you remember Spock, who was very it should always be about reason and rationality, and yet the other part of Darius has a very warm soul, right? Okay. So what we find out about Darius through the book, I don't know where now I've got to be careful because I don't want to reveal anything you haven't read yet, but he's a wonderful human, and he doesn't seem like it, right? To outsiders he seems very stoic, and you called him worldly, which I think is a very fair description of him. So by the time we meet Darius, he's been in the Soviet army, and he was conscript in Afghanistan, and through that, you say he's like a spy. He was in some ways a spy. He collaborated with the Mujahideen, and because he despised the Soviet Union. This is it. This is kind of the irony. So Darius wasn't alone, and so I certainly the character Darius that I portray, that certainly has a big impact on him. We always thought of that kind of that Soviet army as being like a red menace, a red Russian menace, right? It was much more bizarre than that. It was a conscript army, a lot of conscripts, and it was also filled with people like Darius. We think of it as all Russia at that time. It wasn't. They were troops that were conscripts from Georgia, from Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, all these republics which were not sympathetic to the Soviet Union. And so you can imagine being forced into this military, which is what happened to him, and he decides to create his own his own history by working with Georgian and working with the Mujahideen and to sell drugs at the time. And then he has to get out of his handlers in the Mujahideen realize that the Soviet authorities are working it out, that and he could get caught. So they take out their people and they walk them to Pakistan, to a place called Peshawar, and from there they're airlifted out to the UK, and then we begin the storyline in the UK with him being a refugee. So by the time he meets Vanna, he's had a lot of world experience, and it hasn't always been positive. So you can understand that austere spy-like approach to the world that really doesn't depict the real Darius that you'll get to learn about hopefully as the book progresses.
Okay, and the thing
Something to look forward to.
And the thing is, these are characters you make up. Like, I mean, that's the thing with writing, you make up these characters and you want the reader to care about them, and good on you, because I sure do. And I like it when you bring in fact. Okay. And we'll get into that too, like real life facts. So through Darius, the readers, I know I got an education. Like you said, Darius is a Soviet conscript. He meets Zurab. Am I saying that
Zurab,
right?
yeah.
Okay. Who's Georgian.
Georgian, yeah.
And they're selling drugs to the Soviet soldiers. And I remember seeing, I don't know if it was a newspaper article or I had heard that Soviet soldiers have a heroin problem. Okay. It was something I had just heard and I went, oh, wow. And then I kind of went on with my life, and didn't think much more of it. You have dialogue in your book in which Darius says to Zurab, like, I thought this dialogue was dynamite. He says, you are bringing something sorely overdue to this Soviet army, private enterprise. And he's talking about selling drugs, isn't he?
Yes. Yeah.
Whoa. Wow. Okay.
Derek's very impressed with that.
Yeah. And it's just, it's neat when you read something and you go, whoa, okay. Just when you think of Soviet army and what they're talking about. Okay. So then Darius asked him, what's he going to do with the money?
Yep.
And Zurab responds that he's using all his money to bring about the defeat of Soviet forces in Afghanistan. Gordon. Okay. Then another part I really like, you write on, I think it's on page 78, you write that some of the Soviet soldiers, this blew my mind. Some of the Soviet soldiers would trade their weapons when they ran out of money so they could learning about the heroin problem with the Soviet soldiers and them trading their weapons. How did you find out about all that?
The heroin problem with Soviet forces in Afghanistan is pretty well known, so I gave you a little flavor of the conscript mentality. I'll talk a little bit about that. Well, let me answer your first question, then I'll work backwards a little bit to explain some of this stuff. But you've got these conscripts, and some of them are from Russia as well, and they might be a little bit more interested in winning the war. Many of them were more interested in just going home, and it was a pretty rough gig. And heroin provided some. Was very prevalent in Afghanistan, still is one of the largest producers, and it gave them some relief from the current situation. And one of the interesting things that occurred during this period, and it's pretty significant, and I'll tell you a little bit more in a moment, but Western reporters were actually able to get into Afghanistan during the war. Okay. And able to report on these kinds of circumstances and what have you. What's interesting is the people that got them in were Mujahideen. They were in collusion at that time with the Americans and the British, which was ironic because later on they become enemies. But at that time they were very much allies. And so we were, Western viewers were invited to have a firsthand view. And I think there's many things that are surprising about some of that footage. One is the interaction between Mujahideen, who are the enemy, with Soviet soldiers. So there were connections within the forces, usually linked to the drug trade. And and those that were just addicts and those who wanted to make some extra money. So it wasn't about, Soviet soldiers were very badly paid. This wasn't a war about being right for the people that were fighting it. It was a war about what could you get out of it, well, how could you survive it, and when could you go home? And it's kind of a real anomaly in military history. So you had an interview with the editor-in-chief of the Baltic Times, and you say that the 1990s was a strange time for Lithuania. There was little heat, no hot water, crowded living conditions, pitiful salaries, overcrowding, yet it was a time of hope.
and you have real historic events with facts. You have espionage, human smuggling, yet intertwined with all that, I say okay, so let's say 2 love stories and a couple who are together. Okay. And so did you feel that the love stories was like a vehicle to show your character's struggles and growth and to show hope, as you had mentioned to this editor-in-chief of the Baltic Times?
Well, that's a great question. So this book is not a history book. It very much is about the life of these 6 people with the backdrop of the tenor of the times of this important decade that's occurring around them. And love is one of those elements. These are young people, and not only is there the relationship between the couples, but what I wanted to demonstrate in the book is the love between them. So these are friendships that would have been impossible except for the revolutions in Eastern Europe that allowed them to occur. And I'm fascinated with unorthodox love, as you will find, or maybe have already found in the book. So I think Vanna actually has this. She has a marriage of convenience, and she falls in love with her husband.
Good.
So, which I think is quite cute in a way, and he falls in love with her. But there's another one. If I can diverge a little bit. So the answer to your question is yes. I'm trying to depict the real life of these people, and not to put them in positions of where this is a history lesson, right? This is this is their lives. But if you allow me, I'll tell you, I really enjoyed writing one part of this love story, and if you allow me, I'll tell the listeners what without giving too much away.
Yeah, you got me at a cliffhanger now. Yeah.
But one of the relationships involves a Russian. She's an ethnic Russian girl who lives in Klaipėda. She's ethnic Russian Lithuanian girl. She lives in Klaipėda, is on a coastal city, and the teacher, who's an American teacher, George, they have a relationship, and it's quite a cute love story. And she works in a coffee shop, and she actually works full-time with special needs kids. Okay. But she works in this coffee shop part-time, and this was really normal for the times. So state jobs like teachers or even doctors, they were notoriously badly paid during this era, and people turned to the new free enterprise system as a way of making money on the side. So that would mean, going to the market to sell things, and bringing stuff in from the West and selling them, and producing more from your garden to sell it, or working somewhere like in a shop or a coffee shop or what have you. But anyway, she's working in this coffee shop. He comes in every Saturday and for his coffee, and he begins his fantasy of her, right? He's really obsessed with this kind of fantasy, and the fantasy is interrupted a little bit because one time they're there and it's not that busy, and she comes and sits with him, and so he doesn't know how he feels about that because I think we've all had fantasies, and this reality sometimes starts to infringe on the fantasy, and it's not so nice. And he doesn't know what to think about this, and also the conversation is very hard because she doesn't speak English and his Lithuanian is really poor. And but a few days after this event, he happens to bump into her, ironically enough, in the market, in a place that he wasn't expecting to see her, and it was a surprise. And she says something to him. He turns around and he does something quite odd. He hugs her.
Oh, wow.
And it was something that probably wouldn't be okay in our society, definitely not in Eastern society and culture. And there's also a big age gap, right? She's 19. We find out later in the book. He's about 23, but he does this, and he's surprised that he does it. It was just a shock to see somebody familiar face in a place that made him a little bit nervous. And she just goes with it. She's very easygoing character.
Yeah.
And from there, the next Saturday, now he's really upset about this. He's embarrassed himself. His fantasy's been interrupted. He doesn't know how this is going to react. He even hesitates about going back there, but he goes on the Saturday. It's another quieter day, and she serves him his coffee. Everything's okay, and then she comes and sits with him again. She's learned a few. She learned a few English words to see if you could start a conversation, and she asks him if he wants to go and see a museum. And then so we have this strange ritual of dating that occurs where they don't have a common language, and it's they communicate, and it's quite a beautiful, I think it's quite a beautiful story about how they conduct this romantic relationship. And it actually, he becomes even more obsessed with her, and asks her to marry him. And this is where the media attention with the Lithuanian media was really focused on the marriage of Tanya. It was because it was such a common phenomenon that no one had really been able to, I think, to articulate previously. So you had this clash, firstly, this clash of cultures. It was very common for Lithuanian girls to marry foreigners at that time. And there was a mass exodus of that demographic. And even in this book, there's a joke that's made by Darius about the export. One of their biggest exports, right, is young women, right? And it's such a hard thing, and there's lots of reasons for it. I think that's a whole new interview. But she's really torn because her in Eastern culture, there's such a close connection between family and network of friends. It's often called the network of family and friends. And one of her caveats to marrying this American was that she needs to be there to support her mother and her son, and her brother, her mother's son, who has Down syndrome. And so she's outraged when the American has been talking to a firm in Seattle and has a job offer, right? And she's absolutely distraught about this, and she goes home to her mother and says she's done with this jerk and blah blah blah. Can't believe he would do that. And the mother actually talks her into taking a chance and going with him to America. And so there's a perfunctory wedding. It's rushed because they need an American visa. This was very usual. This was not unusual at all. Because they needed. It wasn't like the story of the French girl and George at the beginning, where they're traveling around doing. If you want to be with your Lithuanian girlfriend, you sort of have to make a commitment. It's because no one wants Lithuanian passport holders coming into Britain or America or whatever at that time, right? So there were a lot of marriages that were rushed through, and then she begins this time in America where she's used to this supported network of family, and she's by herself with a husband that she's only known a few months for all of her emotional needs, and they're high because she's in a culture she doesn't understand. She's dealing in a language that she doesn't understand, and that was really compelling for the Lithuanian media, not only in Lithuania but for the diaspora who had come to America during that period, right? I think it speaks to particularly young women who found themselves in these relationships, right? And that the story of Tanya is very, I hope, resonates with that demographic.
Wow, it's interesting. It's interesting what.
I hope I haven't spoiled that piece of the book.
No,
I left out a lot of stuff.
Because now, I think that story, does that continue to book 2?
It does. Yes. Oh, you've obviously been reading. Yes, I had a new book coming out. It just came out last month, and it does. It continues that beautiful relationship between George and Tanya.
So, getting back to Lithuanian Lullaby. So, Dealer's Child is coming out in September. I highlight events in 1968. So I'm working fiction into nonfiction or nonfiction. Yeah, that's it's mostly
Yeah,
fiction. Okay.
I know where you're going. Yeah.
Yeah. So I need a timeline to keep events in order and even birth dates. Okay. For example, you had mentioned in the beginning about, doing that reader's proof of your book, how many times. And I bring in in 1968, Mexico had the Olympics, and it was in October. So it was weird because I'm reading, and I don't think readers understand where I mention Mexico Olympics 1968 October, and then I have a line where my character is saying how she's listening to Steppenwolf's Magic Carpet Ride, and I just thought, was it released? When was it released? Yeah. Right? When was this song released in conjunction with the Olympics? Right? So, like you said, yeah. I'm on Google. Okay, it was released September 1968. Okay, and then I'm reading again, and I mentioned the Rolling Stones. Can't Get No Satisfaction. Yep. And it's like, when was that released? 1965. And I'm like, okay, I'm good. And it all came about because my editor, she had pointed out to me, it had to do with my heroine's birth date in conjunction with the mom's birth date in conjunction with events that were happening in 1968. Like, you need a timeline. So
it's tough.
Your book covers 10 years.
Yes, it was tough.
I was going to say, what did you do? Did you have like a timeline, an Excel spreadsheet?
Well, I always, this was some advice I received, that once you've completed the book, make sure you have an Excel spreadsheet, right, where you're actually plotting that timeline, because chances are you have to rewrite parts of it, right? And it's so hard because you don't want to lose the flow of the thing. So you're writing and you're throwing in stuff, and then you have to go back and check and say, was that correct? And the timeline or what have you. And there's a lot of research, but I probably like yourself. So after thorough research and building my spreadsheet and going back and rechecking and you know what, you'll be in the middle of the night and this thing will come to you and say, could that have happened? Just a minute, I don't remember when that song came out, or when that well, maybe the Olympics didn't start till or that kind of thing, but this is it. So what I did was, even though I thought I had encapsulated and been pretty thorough, it goes off to the story readers. Yeah. And I chosen two story readers specific, and some others, but two specifically because of their background. One was a historian, the other one was a civil servant, because there's a big British civil service byline in the story. And civil servant came back with a whole bunch of minor stuff, which surprised me because I thought I'd written it, but sure enough, it was the time, what I was saying was right, but the timing wasn't quite right. It's so I was writing about the 1980s, and this didn't, or the 90s, and he said, no, that stopped in the 80s, or this, or and this kind of stuff. So I had to rewrite that piece. But it was a Lithuanian historian that was really interesting. He had gotten, there was about 50. He had taken the extra step of actually rewriting suggestion. Oh, wow. Okay. And I think I took all of them except one, which was a bit of an argument between us. But he had written about 15 locations where he felt that it wasn't that it was wrong. It's just that he felt that the nuance wasn't quite right. Okay. And that the character would have probably have done it slightly differently. And so we did that. I rewrote it. But for story readers, I don't know how you operate, but I didn't offer any cash incentives. I sent them gifts afterwards. But he asked me, actually, I knew I was onto something. Wine. And lots of wine. And you know what? They probably deserve a case. I don't think I said a case. But I knew I was into something when he he asked for something. His view of the book was that he really wanted the 15 changes to be made because he thought the book was very important to the telling of the story of his people, and which I was very complimented by. But the he had included a piece, and he said, I would like you to consider this. And he wanted a cameo appearance of someone with his wife's name.
Oh, jeez.
And he was quite humble about it, but I was quite chuffed that somebody would actually want this. So it didn't quite work with, I wrote it in. I had to work on his work a little bit, but I don't think you tell me, when you finish the book, you can tell me where you thought that cameo was.
Okay.
But yeah, it was a real compliment. And so that was part of my gift back to him, was that I could include his wife's name in the book.
The cover you mentioned about, it was done in the UK. So this cover, I'm going to bring it up again. Here we go. I'm trying to hide my bookmark because I don't want everyone to see my crappy little bookmark. So this cover, it's beautiful. So is this is an actual city?
Yes.
Okay. Talk to me about this cover.
It is beautiful. Now, I'm a little bashful about talking to the cover with you because I've seen some of your art, Joanna. So I wish I could claim that I was creative and artistic like yourself, but I'm mostly a poser. That's a beautiful. It was a beautiful book cover, and I can't take any credit for it. That city is Vilnius, under a moonlit sky, and the crescent moon sky, and I can tell you, they sent the publisher, along with the manuscript, a view of what I wanted in this book, and there was a couple of PowerPoint slides. One was 6 people on it, and another one was very, very busy. And he replied with that cover. And if you really look, if you look at the cover carefully, you'll actually notice there's 6 stars, 3 in the east and 3 in the west. So his suggestion by sending me out was, do away with all these faces on the book of your cover. Let the reader's imagination capture that, and you let those symbolize those stars in the sky, right? It's a beautiful cover.
Cool. Oh yeah, not faces.
No.
Here.
Yeah, east and west. And as you can see, that's a beautiful city. A lot of people don't. I think a lot of attention has been drawn to Lithuania by readers that have read this book that have not seen Lithuania. Not only to that history, but the beauty of this country. It has beautiful, beautiful beaches. It has beautiful cities that are from the Middle Ages, and Lithuania was spared a lot of the architectural damage that occurred after the war, and they survived. A lot of these buildings, and it's depicted in the book, also survived neglect. The Soviets really wanted to treat the backwaters, the provinces. They didn't want to put their resources there, right? The old town of like Vilnius or Klaipėda or some of the other cities, they were really run down when I lived there, but they have been completely restored and are very beautiful locations. Well worth a visit if you're ever in Europe, Joanna.
Okay. So, Gordon, is there anything you would like to add? What are you working on next? You've just had a second book come out, so that you got to be working on something.
Yes, well, I'm going through a thinking process. So yes, the Angels of Klaipėda just came out, and it's a book that it actually shifts gear a little bit. We don't deal so much with the history of Lithuania, more so Lebanon, because one of the characters is taken hostage, and I wanted. They say never write a book about Islamic terrorism. People around the world are tired of that, but I have written a book, but it has a different feel for it, and it might be a little bit more controversial. There's a main character in the book whose views are very much aligned with with Hezbollah, and her views are treated very sympathetically, and she gets an opportunity to portray why she's there, right?
Yeah.
Why she has those thoughts. So we'll see. It's a very, very different book. So that one's that's book 2. No, that's book 2.
That's book 2?
Angels
Oh,
of
okay.
Klaipeda. So it has an ironic name because it revolves around Tanya, who goes back to Klaipeda, which is in Lithuania. But it's a different kind of book there, very different than Lithuanian Lullaby. The third book I'm still working on. Again, there's a really interest, and I can tell that from yourself as well, Joanna, in Vanna and what happens to her. Yeah. And at the end of that last book, she's built up this life, and she's pregnant actually in the last few pages. Let other please go. And there is interest in what happens to her. You know what I wanted to do? I wanted to go back, and I started a bunch of research. I wanted to actually, instead of going forward, because in some ways she's reached a kind of zenith in her life, even though she's in her late 20s. But I wanted to go back to Hungary in the 1980s and explore that teenager, right? And how she got where, but when I started working on it, it became much harder than I thought. And you're really strapped when you strap yourself like that too, because you know where it has to go. She has to get across that fence. And I wanted to build that character and understand that teenager that she was. But in the end, I don't think I'm going to go that way. So we'll see. But I'm thinking about that anyway.
That's interesting. Oh God, I could talk about characters, and I could talk. Oh God, I love talking about writing.
Well, and also I do take liberties, and certainly Tanya in the second book is so I believe there's a little bit of evil in everyone and a little bit of good in everybody, and so in the characters, sometimes they do things that you may not subscribe to, but still are very endeared to them, and sometimes the bad guys turn out to be good. So it's if you can pull that off and it's believable, then it can have a real impact on readers.
Yeah. So one last thing. Oh God, you were talking about, I'm just thinking, when you said there's a little bit of evil and a little bit of good in a person, when you were talking about Darius and how the Soviet army, and some of them, they were paid poorly, and they would sell the drugs. When you were mentioning that, I was thinking about, okay, if you put your average, I say average, meaning I mean a non-criminal, okay, because I come from working at the prosecutor's office. You put someone in that army who, let's say, doesn't have a criminal record, has never taken drugs, but you put that character in that sort of a situation, how much will they endure before they may start selling drugs just to try to get a better life? Like, I'm not saying that's what they should do, but that's, to me, that is the question I always like.
Yes, it is. And you're quite right, because what I don't explore, and you're quite right, is the impacts of that on those comrades that he's selling those drugs to. Which, but he, for him, it's ideological, and put in that situation where he's been forced into fighting this war, which he opposes against people that he's not interested in fighting against. He makes this decision, and I don't explore those who could have overdosed or died or what have you. But one of the key reasons he's doing is because it slows things down, right? It slows down the military apparatus, and it also provides a source for money to the Mujahideen. So the drugs that he sells, he keeps a commission, but the remainder of the money goes back to help supply the Mujahideen with armaments in order to defeat the Soviet forces. So it's a is he evil for doing that? I'll let the readers figure that out.
Well, it's that doing something not morally acceptable, like selling drugs to soldiers, but your justification is for a good cause, or a good, in your mind, for a good reason, right?
And I think in this case, perhaps legitimate, but you also have to be careful, and you'll see some of this stuff of rationalization, where you take morally bad decisions and you rationalize them. I don't know how many times you've seen people do that. And so where does it stop, right? Where does something bad that you've done is justifiable because the outcome is what needs to occur versus I've done something bad and I'm going to justify it based on this, right? And, I wouldn't accuse Darius of that in Lithuanian Lullaby. I think he's doing what he feels is the right thing to do in order to stop that aggression in Afghanistan.
Yeah. Gordon, this has been great.
Yeah, this has been fantastic, Joanna. Pleasure.
Yeah. So I haven't been booking podcasts for next year yet, but if you like, I mean, this is 6 months since this book came out and people are still talking about it. Okay. So 6 months from now, if you're free in January and we could talk about
Angels of Klaipeda.
I haven't had my coffee, honestly. I've done pretty good. Seriously.
Well, I think you've done very well with those questions. You put me on the spot, so that's I don't think you need it.
Well, but anyways, if you are interested, early January, we could do another podcast talking about your second book.
Oh, I would love that. I hope people are interested in the Angels of Klaipeda by 2022. But sign me up, Joanna. And thank you so much again for taking the time.
Good. This has been fun. Okay. Bye, Gordon.
Bye-bye.